This is being recorded. Trying to figure out a way to make the presentations available after the fact. If you would like to unmute yourself, if you're online, once we come to the end for questions, please do so, or you can type questions into the chat. So I'm happy to introduce, I'm sure you all know Sam Laney. He's our new Director of Engineering Development Division. He started in January. He got his bachelor's in agricultural and biological engineering from Cornell. He has a master's and a PhD in oceanography from OSU. And probably most interestingly, now has a master's of education from the University of Massachusetts. Before coming to PML, he had a research program at WHOI, which he can describe better than I can. He was also director of WHOI's AVAST initiative with the goal of fostering new ocean technology innovations in autonomous vehicles and sensors.
Sure.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks everybody for being here, and those of you online. I hope you feel free to send your questions in at the end as well. Like Trish said, I've been here for 3 months, and I really looked forward to the opportunity to present myself to you, to meet people in the lab, sort of on a more formal basis outside of the hall. I have a very unusual background, and I find that it's difficult to describe sometimes because people ask me what I've done in life, and it doesn't really fall into categories that people are familiar with. It kind of looks like a hopping around of a bunch of different activities and professions, and in a sense it is, but it's also been very intentional through my life. I'm a very interdisciplinary thinker. I'm a very interdisciplinary doer. As I start describing my life and my professional career to date, I think you'll get a sense of that. That there's some value to being at this interface. I mean, there's some bad things about being in the interface as well. People sometimes don't know where to put you. For me, as an oceanographer and an engineer, it was almost impossible to find a job out of graduate school because I wasn't engineering enough for an engineering professor job, and I wasn't oceanographic enough for a purely oceanographic job. So there were a lot of no's to job searches before I actually found a place to land. But there are a lot of benefits too, and that's one of the things I want to communicate today is how I will be coming at this job, at least my mindset, in a role not necessarily as a supervisory engineer, although that's my title, but more of like a chief technologist or a matchmaker, somebody who brings technology and science together. And I'll give you some examples today of some of the ways that's happened over the course of my career. Just in case you're interested in this picture, it's me with some oceanographic technology that was returned from the Arctic Ocean. The background is the Alaska Pipeline at the very north spit of what's called West Dock in Prudhoe Bay. I just bring this picture up because I've been using it for years and I didn't realize until yesterday that I'm wearing a NOAA hat. I've got a Dyson hat on. So I've been apparently advertising NOAA a lot in my talks, and I'll try to point that out as I go along. But I got the Dyson hat after being on this cruise, 2007 Basis cruise, the first one where Dyson went to the Arctic Circle. We all got Blue Nose. This was advertised in NOAA-wide emails back then. And that's where I first got my contact with them, and I'm actually quite happy to be back in the room. So these are my goals for the seminar. It's going to be light on science, it's going to be light on technology, but I'm going to try to focus instead on first giving you this perspective about my career to date and my professional interests and my perspectives on technology and geoscience. I'll then next have a little bit of a discussion about how I see these things coming together. We talk a lot about interdisciplinary science in oceanography and other fields of geoscience, but people who study this use terms like integrative, and I'm starting to favor using these terms, and you'll hear them throughout the talk. And then a little bit about how, like I was saying, my perspective about how I might fit in here is less of a pure engineer and more of a technologist. And then I'll just talk about 3 prior projects that I've worked on where these 2 fields have come together in different ways. Examples that have, in all cases, I feel, opened up new avenues of ocean science and in some cases technology, and provided new insight into important things about the ocean environment. And then, the subtext here, of course, is I hope this enthuses you so that you will come to me if you have similar interests or it sparks some idea. You will come and talk to me or Scott or Noah, other people on the team, and start bouncing ideas around that, hey, this is a direction we'd like to move forward with. How can EDD help? So please put that on your plate for after this talk, even immediately or in the future. Okay. I consider myself somebody who wears 3 hats. I started out my career as an R&D design engineer at Department of Energy, working on a certain class of oceanographic instrumentation. My job was basically a translator because I had an engineering background and a science background. I would go ask the scientists what they needed to happen. I would go tell the engineers what the scientists' dreams were. The engineers would tell me that it could not physically be made because the circuit won't work or there's not a glue strong enough. And then doing this dance, this translating back and forth to get both sides to harmonize to something that can be achieved and also is scientifically valuable. And after I worked for the DOE, I went into industry and private consulting as a technology transfer engineer on this technology, which we moved to Britain. It got a national award. The company still making money on it. I got tired after a while of being told that I should be a manager because I wanted to do my stuff. So I went back to graduate school at Oregon State and studied phytoplankton and photophysiology and ecology, and studied the optical properties of oceanic waters. And while I was doing that degree, I was also earning a minor in electrical engineering. And as Trish mentioned, I have an interest in education. I've always had an interest in graduate and undergraduate education, so post-secondary education, and specifically, how do you train cross-disciplinary students? So I haven't had many students, I've had 3, but they are all excellent cross-disciplinary students, and people routinely would ask me, when am I training more? And I would tell them, if you knew how hard it was to train a cross-disciplinary student in a disciplinary institution, you wouldn't be so free with this ask. But that's how I see myself, a person who wears 3 hats. And this balance changes over time, depends on what stage of career I'm at. And I think, as Trish mentioned, with my formal education background, this has been lifelong. So I'm one of the few oceanographers I know of who has basically an ag degree as an undergraduate, but it was this weird joint program between a science college and an engineering college, and it was kind of a mess. This was the early 90s, late 80s, when they were trying to figure out in various universities in the US how to make what's turned out to be biological engineering as a discipline. At Oregon State, it was also not terribly easy to do this. I was actually rejected for the interdisciplinary program and told at best I should try a master's. And then after I succeeded with my master's, people were very happy to let me do what I wanted to do, which was to major in oceanography and minor in electrical engineering. And even my education work was very, I would say, interdisciplinary in a sense, because what I was focusing on when I was taking my master's these last few years is how do we build models in college for training STEM specialists to work in cross-disciplinary fields. And the program I was in is also extremely well known for what's called social justice education, which is DEI in educational formats. It's another thing I'm very interested in. And as Trish said, I've spent most of my professional year at UWI. So I spent 17 years there. I came in as a postdoc. I ended up as a senior scientist in the biology department. That's equivalent of a full professor. I was placed in the biology department because at that time I was probably 70-30, weighted a little bit more to doing oceanography. But over the career there, it's been roughly 50-50. Half of my papers are oceanography, half of my papers are instrumentation or technology. I've been the PI on roughly 20 projects, mostly funded from NASA. So I've been awarded the New Investigator Award. I did a lot of work under carbon and climate, ecosystems, and IDS is interdisciplinary science. It's a special pool that I was asked to propose to, given my programs have been successful in interdisciplinary work. And I also floated myself at WHOI a lot on internal money. So WHOI has a nice pot of money for fostering innovation. They give out internal awards. And the idea is maybe not every one will be great, but if you get 1 out of 7 that's really successful, that can turn into a really impactful global scale project. So I mentioned teach students. So I was on 3 different faculties at Woods Hole. I was in the biology faculty, I was in the chemical oceanography faculty, and I was in the engineering faculty teaching introductory courses and all of those disciplines. And as Trish also said, my capstone, what I did last when I left, was leading the new Avast initiative. I just want to describe what that is because I had a really good time with it. And a lot of what lessons learned there are in my head still as I moved into PMEL. So AVAST, like Trish said, stands for Autonomous Vehicles and Sensing Technology. It was just a catch-all term because there were a lot of people in different units at HUI who worked on these types of things. And the institution wanted to resource them more intelligently, resource them not just with stuff that they can use, but also people who can help them catalyze ideas into reality, into projects, into demonstrations that could be used in proposals. And so it has a physical presence. I had a part of the building with test equipment and engineering spaces. This is another picture I use all the time, and I realized that 3 of the vehicles here are basically receiving no funding. So the LRAP on the bottom was getting money from fisheries, the key deep submergence vehicles at the top, Orpheus and NUI were paid in part or project paid in part by ocean exploration. And actually, outside this picture are other rooms with other scientists and engineers and under my help working on carbon sensing instruments. Like Anna Michelle's group had a room that we supported for 2 years working on a new type of methane sensor. So this was a way to bring people and resources together and then give them the people and resources to support them so they can just focus on their science and technology development. So I have a team of engineers, field specialists, machinists, admin people who would help just support the researchers from behind so that they could focus on innovation. And the outcomes were really cool. So within a year, the Institute could see if these types of synergies are good. And you shouldn't have to say why it's good to get people excited about innovation. But even within a year, we had any number of projects that had people who had no exposure to technology, who didn't know how to solve a problem, came to us. We helped them through a solution. We matched them with the right people, and they ended up having new valuable things that will be used in their research going forward. And this type of thinking is what I would like to help out here at PML. If there are these opportunities, I have a recipe in my head for, I think, how we can move forward on these types of things. Just for example, upper left is somebody who's doing sampling of methane seeps, and they need to build a little thing that Shell Oil could deploy with an ROV biomethane seep in an oil field. So we help them build that. In the bottom left is Ted Maxim, who's a scientist, who's a sea ice geophysicist. He needed instrumentation throughout the field, and he needed a higher level of electronics expertise than he has in his head. The upper right is Lauren Molyneux. She's a biologist who needed a high pressure thing to measure or to monitor organisms that she pulls out of deep sea vent communities so she can look at them under the microscope. All of these things springboarded further research. Then at the end, they were a tool that we built for the scientists to go away. So this is my mindset. This is one of the things I really like doing. And I'm hoping that, over the next 6 months, year, we'll be able to pick some of the ideas from your brain and move forward with them as well in a similar way. So I buy this, that integrating across disciplines is essential for research. Certainly, I think I was mentioning earlier to somebody that this wasn't actually coming up through the academic tiers. If you're in a department, they want you to do things that the department identifies with. They don't like spreading out. And despite that, I think I've been able to show a lot of achievements, scientific and technical, in my career that are interesting because I was looking at things outside or at the margins of a traditional discipline, or I was reaching out to some sort of non-research stakeholder and bringing them in, especially in the Arctic work. That was a very important thing in Alaska. Or a project that requires a team that has sort of a certain mindset of being generalists and specialists at the same time to tackle these types of problems. And then certainly with a background in engineering, professional experience, I fold in engineering to this recipe as well. This has been very, very exciting 30 years. I did promise, I gave the scope of this talk as 3 decades of the interface. And I just made a map for this, for my career, for a talk I gave to some graduate students about 6 months ago who were interested in interdisciplinary lifestyle and interdisciplinary careers. And they asked me what mine was. I'm like, I don't think I've ever listed it out. But I did it, and I'm not going to go through the laundry list, but I started out actually studying philosophy. Then I had my bio degree. Then I worked in the field. Then I went back to school. then I got a tenure track position, and I actually went back to school at 50, get another master's. Then started doing leadership. And the way this starts to fall out is that you'll see that the mix of the natural sciences, the technology and engineering, the humanities and social science, and sort of like the organizational management side of things, they all kind of go together. I'm not hopping around on this. They're all knitted together. And this is lucky in a sense. I know a lot of people are not able to have this type of flexibility in their careers. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. This just happens to be the way that I've done it over 30 years for me. When I try to describe what this lifestyle is like, what this type of being a scientist is like, it took me a long time to realize that I actually knew of an analog. And that analog is in the field of medicine, where they train people to be internists, people who specialize in internal medicine. So you know a lot of physicians who are cardiologists, right? They deal with the heart and circulatory system, or neurologists, or infectious disease specialists. Like, these are specialties within medicine. But medicine also has a specialty of non-specialty called internal medicine, people who deal with multi-organ or multi-system disorders. These are things that are now, as I get older and older, more of a concern to me: obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. These are the types of things that a specialist can't deal with. You need a generalist, but a generalist who's trained in multi-organ, multi-system specialties. So, I guess the most popular one on TV, is Dr. House from the program, where he solves all these complex things that fall between medical disciplines. And it makes you ask the question, in geoscience or ocean science, what would be analogs? Like, what type of phenomena are there that would be like this in medicine? What things are multi-system or multi-domain? And there are any number of them, and most of you here work on one or more of these. So coastal systems, polar systems, climate systems, anything that's got to do with land-sea interactions, fisheries, things that cross an oceanographic field with fisheries or stock management field, biogeochemical cycles. These are all areas of inquiry that, in my mind, require people to have integrative thinking. And we don't actually have many programs to train people in that type of specialty thinking, which is something I'm, just another piece of professional interest. In my career, more recently, over the past, let's say, 8 to 10 years, I've been working on one of these complex multi-system phenomena, which is the spring freshet in the Alaskan Arctic. So freshet is when, snowpack on land melts and it goes into rivers and then eventually goes into the ocean. And in most places, most temperate parts of the world, that melted snowpack goes into a liquid ocean. And in the Arctic, it doesn't, because a lot of the rivers, at least here in Alaska, they're flowing north. And when that lower latitude snowpack melts, it flows north, downslope, onto sea ice. So this is a really interesting phenomenon. It happens very quickly, in a couple of weeks. It contains a lot of organic material that's going from the land into the ocean. And then there's all these really crazy dynamics that happen when this water hits the physical and ecological environment in the coastal ocean. And to me, that was a really interesting problem to tackle for 10 years. It was also a interesting technical problem. We have this scenario where, seasonally in August and September, there is no sea ice. It starts to form in the late fall, November or so. It thickens, and it thins, and it plates as you move into spring, and then it breaks up. And then you have open water again. That's the typical seasonal cycle. Unfortunately, the period I was particularly interested in, the spring freshet, is one of the most difficult and dangerous times to be there. It is very, very bad to try to be on the water when the river is showing up. And so it calls for an autonomous technological solution in order to observe the system, not just during Arctic winter, but during a really dangerous time in the spring. So the way we tackled this problem was just using standard bottom moorings that we built that survive ice out. We developed some ice buoys that we could go out on snowmobiles right before the freshet arrived, deploy them through the ice so that little sensors underneath the ice will detect the arrival of the freshet. The freshet happens, and in the fall, when we can go back and get our bottom moorings, we grab it. This is one approach to getting the seasonal picture of this complex phenomenon. I won't go into the technology too much because it's published. Actually, I won't go into the science too much because it's published too, but just to give you a taste of what we did in this particular project, it was very simple. We wanted this to be inexpensive and effectively disposable if need be. Just a basic data logger with a GPS and iridium system that we could stick a spar through a hole in the sea ice and then put a cluster of sensors somewhere close to the bottom of the ice, which is where the freshet water will run, sitting on top of the denser seawater when it arrives in spring. So we plant these before the freshet arrives. And it was a very simple operation because there's very little logistical support that you can bank on in the Arctic. It's going on snowmobiles and ice auger and putting things together and sticking it in by hand. Sort of like, think of raising the flag on Mount Suribachi when I see this picture, but that wasn't the plan. So this is an example of where, we didn't want to use very complicated technology or invent something terribly sophisticated because we didn't need that. We just needed something simple and straightforward in order to make these new, as of this point, never ever been done types of observations over these scales. That's a theme you might see through the rest of the talk. They worked. It was very interesting. We could see definitely in terms of temperature, the arrival of the freshet somewhere in early June of this year, because it went from the coldest the seawater can get to the coldest that freshwater can get, so remain liquid. And then other sensors that we had in line with the temperature measurement showed us some indices of dissolved organic carbon and particulate organic carbon that we were interested in, not just the temperature of the arriving freshet, but the chemistry and the biogeochemistry of it. So this is just an example of the types of data and scales we were looking at. I also mentioned that we did these bottom warnings. It was the same operation, do something very simple, that only the technology you need to get the types of measurements that you want. Don't spend a lot of time on inventing something custom. Reuse and repurpose as much existing things as possible. We had a special challenge here because we're only deploying in roughly 8 meters of water, and the ice keels can easily scrub it. We were very close to shore to be right in front of those rivers. But we also needed sensors that could be reliable for a year, and that's almost never guaranteed in these environments. We put, I want to say kitchen sink, but we put the appropriate amount of things on it for the types of observations we were trying to get. So an ADCP that looks up to track the ice cover and its thickness and arrival and loss, a CT sensor so we can get sort of a sense of the water masses in the lagoon, an optical sensor to look at changes in different optical properties that tell us things about the changing environment. Interestingly, maybe to some people here, they gave us money to try to see if a PCO2 sensor could work. One of these commercial ones over the year. And I'm not going to get into the details of observations as well. This is just, some data about a year of deployment under the ice, where the top shows, in this case, PCO2 signature under ice covered during most of the period, and what it looks like during the freshet, during winter time, during open water season, gassing events, photosynthetic events, accumulation events because CO2 is getting trapped underneath the ice. How that relates in the second panel to changes in ice thickness and presence and absence. And then the bottom, how it changes with respect to the physical hydrography of the area. So, again, as far as I know, this is the first time somebody has been able to collect this type of data in this type of environment. And there was a merging of technology and science here. It's just in neither case did we go overboard. The simplest possible tools that we could use to get the most valuable data out as soon as possible. That was just one taste of a certain type of complex environment. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk just touching on 3 other projects that I've worked on where I was, let's say, not the primary technologist in the project. My job was more of a freeloader or a co-PI. These have also been extremely valuable projects, and you will see, I hope, as we go through that, the technology that we added to these existing initiatives is not sophisticated. It's not necessarily pretty, but the results are, first ever observations of these types in the ocean. And again, this is the type of thinking I like to encourage, because it's easy to do easy things. If there's an easy solution and it requires minimal technology, that's kind of what we should be doing, because at the end of the day, our goal is to do science and research. We're a research lab. But the first one will be a buoy project I worked with the FC Interactions group at buoy. The second would be a project that I worked on with the Near Under Ice team, also at buoy, and the third, the Profiler team. So the buoy project was really interesting to me. This was early funded, my participation by NASA, and my interest was from an ocean color remote sensing phytoplankton ecology point of view. I wanted to be able to measure over a year changes in a certain optical property of the ocean that would tell me about phytoplankton photosynthesis, but like every 15 minutes, because I needed to get a diel pattern. And once I could understand how the diel pattern is in a certain day, I can compare it to the next day, the next day, the next day. So it's a day-to-day comparison, but to get the day-to-day indices, you need to really look into the diurnal cycle, the full day cycle of this optical property. And so the approach here was just to find a friend who does a buoy program and has a platform in the ocean, and engineer with them a way that we could put hyperspectral radiometers on their existing buoy to make the measurements that I want without interfering at all with the important, well-calibrated time series work that they were doing. This was fairly straightforward engineering, I would say, by commercial radiometers, hyperspectral radiometers. You arrange them in different places on the marine halo so that you know that they're not going to interfere with, let's say, the anemometers on top or any of the other airflow characteristics that have been on that top part of the halo. And here you can see 3 of the radiometers labeled R. They're actually in those white tubes downward facing, so they're looking at the color of the ocean emanating up into space. And there's also a radiance hyperspectral sensor that's labeled I, that's actually looking straight up at the sky, that's giving the color of light that's impacting the ocean, that's coming down on it. And so the trick is, if you know the color that goes down, you know the color comes back, you do something useful. That's the basic recipe of ocean color remote sensing. I had some other things in there too. I added some subsea sensors and in a radio system there so they could get the data I needed out of the channel. But this was a very interesting project. So this was light engineering, again, the first time anybody had made these observations over a year, and not that expensive. So this was a very easy thing to do, and that data that we got were very valuable. And I won't go into the data too much, except to give you just another flavor of how engineering technology has been beneficial in this project. Like I just said, I was looking at a certain optical property, a certain color property of the ocean over the course of the day, and it is a fluorescence property, so a single color of red whose magnitude changes over the course of the day due to stuff that phytoplankton are doing photosynthetically. I would love to talk to you about it later if you care about phytoplankton photophysiology, but I think over my life I've learned that most people don't. But a normal day of sunlight, at this part of the ocean looks sort of like a sinusoid. The fluorescence that's emanating out of the ocean doesn't quite exactly look like a sinusoid. If you were to plot the light in versus light out on an XY axis, you'll see that there's kind of a loop there. There's some hysteresis, there's some closed. It doesn't just change one way to noon and then exactly reverse itself in the afternoon. It gets a little toasted, it gets a little sunburned. And that degree of difference in that loop has a lot to do with the physiology, the ecology that I'm interested in. For years, people have been looking at it with this kind of template, like, okay, there's just this like TI curve type thing, and that's how we'll interpret it. But, somebody with an electrical engineering background will say, look, this is a system where you have an input and an output transfer function, and you can build a dynamical model of that behavior, and then you can pop this into MATLAB or Simulink and run it backwards and map it back to the data and actually get the parameters of the model extracted from the data, and there's your answer. So this is another interesting flavor where technology and science came together in a new and different way. To the best of my knowledge, no one had really recommended this before, because who's got a background in photophysiology and signal processing, right? There will probably not be another person like that in the next 100 years, but there can be people in the world who can try to keep those people and network them together. So again, this will be something that, if you have any interest in these types of mathematical sides of engineering, please come and talk to 3 of us. The second one I wanted to talk about just briefly is this project we had with the NUI folks, the Nereid Under Ice Vehicle people. I'm interested in the Arctic because of how the light passing through the sea ice affects algal communities in the sea ice and underneath. And, you know, you maybe, for those of you who've never been to the Arctic, you might think that it's kind of like a uniform white ice surface, but it's not. There's a lot of variability in the ice and the snow that really modulates the amount of light that gets through underneath. And here is just a very dramatic example of an ice edge where the polar stone's in front. You can see all the leaves and the breaking up of the ice. Like the light field underneath that ice is really complicated. And I'm interested in how that light field structures why you might see algae in certain spaces or regions underneath there where they might grow well, where they might not. And so this NUI's, this Nereid Under Ice Vehicle seemed like a really good project to work with. It's about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. It has its own batteries, so it can motor away, but it connects back to the ship with a fiber optic cable, the type that they have in the, like when they launch a torpedo, the torpedo is guided, it goes away, it's spooling out some fiber, and then there's a canister on this end that also has some fiber. About 10 kilometers of fiber, so you could, in principle, drive that vehicle 10 kilometers under the ice and do some mapping. And I thought that sounded awesome, because as far as I know, at this time when we did this, it really never been done. Again, this is, it's not even really an engineering approach. It's basically uses things as a pickup truck and to ratchet strap a CTD package to the mount. Like if that's all it takes, that's all it takes. There's really no sense in making something fancy for this experiment because this is the solution that works. It is not pretty. People who build $1 million pretty vehicles don't like that very much. I had somebody tell me it was like, you know, cable tying a milk crate to the top of a Jaguar. I'm like, you know, but if it works. And it did work. So I'll show you some of the data. This is just vehicle imagery. And I'm not, I mean, there's nothing to really learn here unless you're a biologist, but you'll see a lot of flocculent and a lot of dark spots underneath the ice. The dark spots are ice algae. I'd like you to pay a little bit of attention to kind of what you might see in the water column. There's definitely organisms skittering back and forth, things that are motile, but there's also things that stuff that is not motile, like these aggregates, this fluff. Some of that fluff is sinking ice algae. Some of it is a little harder to see, but actually phytoplankton in the water column. And those are the things that were of interest to me. So this is just one example of a track that they did. So the picture is looking down, it's a radar image, and the red line that's sort of going to 7 o'clock is the direction of the bow of the ship. The ship's in the center. And overlaid on the radar image is a yellow track that shows how the vehicle is moving spatially, horizontally. So it went out from the ship, and then it did some zigzagging on the way back. But the red dots indicate points where it stopped its zigzag and it did what was called a pogo. So it just changed its buoyancy and it slowly drifted up to the surface. And it's sort of basically doing an upside down CTD profile while I had my sensors in the mouth of the vehicle sampling water and sampling optics. So that's just to give you a picture of what the mapping was like. And just a taste of the types of data we were able to get with this cruise. This is just salinity. So this is a little bit, the image is kind of skewed a little bit so that you can see the vertical relief, but it's the same track along the bottom with these pogos. And when it's deep, you have salty water, you know, around 34 or so PSU. When it comes near to the surface, it's fresh. This should be no surprise, right? This is just proof that we were actually observing a freshwater lens in certain spots underneath this ice sheet. But the variability in chlorophyll was very interesting. This is just within a kilometer. This track is not bigger than a kilometer in terms of space, but you can see considerable variability, not just vertically, but also spatially in the chlorophyll biomass that we're measuring with a fluorescence sensor. And so this is where it becomes interesting to the biologist. Like, is this structure or is this random? And it's hard to say. This was a very early experiment, but we did some analyses to look at the water column structure in terms of density, and then the panels on the right show how chlorophyll, from chlorophyll fluorometer, and particle backscatter from a backscattering optical sensor pick up the large spikes, which we assume to be aggregates, versus the what I'm going to call background level, which are the smaller particles, the smaller algae that don't ring out as a big lip. But this is the type of information that we would be going forward with. And again, this is the type of thing that, just had never been observed before because.
Where were you?
This is Fram Strait on Polarstern in 2017. Yeah. So this is part of a big German-American project. But yeah, Western Arctic. Okay. Okay. So let me talk about the third one before I wrap it. I said the third one involved, this is kind of in between. There's a little bit more engineering here. But still the vehicle is primarily run by other people for other things. And the vehicle is the ice tether profiler. So that's the vertical tube that you see in the left-hand picture. It's basically a cargo float with a motor on it. So instead of floating up and down based on buoyancy, that little white puck, sort of the chest level with the person next to it, that's got a gear in it, and it clamps onto a cable that is about 800 meters long, and it creeps up and down 4 times a day. Creeps up and down at most 4 times a day over an entire year. And whatever sensors you put on there will measure whatever you want to measure over that amount of time, potentially up to a year or more. These ice tether profilers are now into serial number 120 or so. So they've got 120 deployed in the Arctic. And many of them have done about a year's worth of measurement. And the system that I worked on to add simple sensors to an IPP gave us this first ever view of chlorophyll distributions under Arctic sea ice at about 80 north over an entire year. So a full season of what's going on under the sea ice. Technically, there's not a lot that, and many of you who work with programs that have very high investments in technology and platforms know that once it's refined, you don't really want to be asking for many, many changes. They might not even be possible. And if they are, there's always a risk of interrupting the success of the program they were originally built for. But for me, the major design limitations on Ice Tether Profiler project were whatever you put on, make sure it could go down an 11-inch hole, because no one wanted to drill bigger holes. And I said, that's fine. If this is what it takes, then we'll do it. We spent a lot of time going back and forth, not want to say negotiating, but like confirming that a design addition will not in any way disrupt the types of, in this case, purely physical oceanographic work that they were trying to do. So these IPPs originally came with only Seabird 41CP, which has a CTD with a dissolved oxygen sensor in it. And I wanted to add an optical sensor and a light meter. And in order to make this reliable, we also had to add a third thing, which was a shutter, electromechanical shutter that didn't rely on gears or shafts so that it got banged in the ice and ripped something. So it's a magnetically coupled system. These 3 things are commercially available, and our design challenge was to make these smart things appear dumb as possible to the IQP's host controller, which is not really intended to sample extra sensors. So we deployed maybe, I think, 8 of these. 2 of them did really well. 2 of them we got full years around. So number 48 and number 64. 48 was deployed in the middle of the Central Arctic. 64 was in sort of the Beaufort Gyre. They both lasted for about a year. They are at different latitudes. So one is very, very far north. The other is pretty far north. And you can see that the types of chlorophyll signatures that we saw in these measurements would be what an algal ecologist would think when you talk about a very, very high latitude light limited environment where the algae, in this case on the left-hand picture, stay close to the surface because there's not that much light. Whereas further south, I know it's not really further south the way many people think, but even going down to 70 degrees or so, those algae are living much deeper in the water column, around 50 meters, because the light is stronger and penetrates deeper. So this is, again, is not rocket science. Like I could have predicted this. I just couldn't tell you how deep or how long or how dense. Like the quantitative part is what these observations are really good for. This was actually a really interesting project too. I said it can profile as much as 4 times per day. And I'm sure you can profile it as fast as you want, but the routine is 4 per day during the time of year when things are interesting. And then you put it to sleep a little bit and you do a profile every day or so over the winter when not much is expected. But in aggregate, there are well over 1,000 profiles that we've got at this time, which is really interesting because that means I have profiles not on a daily level, but on a sub-daily level. And being able to leverage that for some biology was really attractive. So these organisms, their lifespans are not that long. It's only on the scale of days. So by sampling shorter than that period, you can learn a lot about their ecology. So we were able to do things like not just look at the day-to-day changes in chlorophyll, which is in the sort of the middle panel here. So take the intensities in the top panel and vertically integrate them to 50 meters and tell me how much chlorophyll is in the water column in the top 50 meters day by day. Great. But once you have that time resolution, you can do things like take a derivative. You can look at day-to-day changes or quarter day-to-day changes. And then you can see instances where the biomass is rapidly increasing or not. And these are really interesting phenomena. We don't know exactly what is going on. Is it in state of growth? Is it more chlorophyll in the water column because it's falling off the sea ice? There are many ways chlorophyll can get in front of your sensor. And these are great questions for an ecologist. You might want to know what's the water column algae versus what's the sea ice that's falling through. And then again, as you'll hopefully get from this talk, I love using sensors in ways they weren't designed. You can see some of these particles, some of these blips of sedimenting sea ice algae. This is what I'm stating and claiming in these optical signatures. And you can count the number of blips in, let's say, the top 700 meters per caps. That's some number of, some proxy for aggregates in the water column at that time. And one of the things I did is I did that throughout the entire growth season and said, okay, how many particles, let's say, this is operation. Anybody wants to talk about it? I've built and worked with active fluorometers of all kinds. If you want to measure fluorescence, I'm interested in that. A particular one is called variable fluorescence. So I spent at least a decade on that. That's basically high-speed probing using light of biological systems and looking at the fluorescence response. Measuring light underwater, very interested in that. Light of all kinds and different types of light fields. If anybody has that type of interest, even from like a physical heat transport point of view, I think that's something I'd like to talk about. Hyperspectral sensors and imaging. While you're measuring light, you might as well do it hyperspectrally now that we can. I have a lot of experience with that. And I did my postdoc in algal cell imaging, so I know some people are familiar with the imaging flow cytobot here. I postdoc in the lab. I built a couple from scratch, took them out on icebreakers, made some new measurements in parts of the world where they hadn't been used before. And so there's more going on if people are interested in those types of topics. So let me just close off with this. my job title is supervisory engineer here in the EDD, and I will do that job. I can be a supervisory engineer, but I can also be a supervisory technologist, and that means speaking to non-engineers and trying to find a common ground where science ideas and technology capabilities can come together in a new and different way. And that's a lot of fun. Like, I think if you ask many engineers why they like being an engineer, it's the creativity. It's kind of artistic. There's a lot of choices to be made. You can tell people's personalities in some sense by how they design stuff. And that's something I've always enjoyed about my career as an engineer. I kind of, in my head, break engineers kind of into two categories. One is the type of people who should be I don't know if I should say this anymore, but the type of people who should be building the wing for, the next Boeing jet. That's a certain type of engineering that has to be done with a certain mindset. And then there's all the other engineers, like in that Apollo 11 movie, where you get a big pile of stuff on the table. It's like they need an oxygen scrubber in space right now. Build it out of this. And that's always been the type of engineering I've been more drawn to. And I think many people in ocean science are like that too. Most technologists who come to ocean science really like that type of creativity. So make use of it. If you want to brainstorm or explore something new, our doors are always open. If I were to try to give acknowledgments for everybody who's been participating in this work with me over the past 30 years, we would be here for another hour. But I just would say, I do not take credit for everything here at all. There are many, many collaborators and funding sources. There are just far too many to name here. But I'd like to stop here and take questions or hear comments or whatever you would like to do. But I want to say thanks for your attention, and please keep the dialogue going if you're at all interested. So thanks. Nick.
Yeah, okay, very interesting. That's really great. And I guess what I see from your slides is, those movies are just so dramatic, really. And I'm just wondering, I think that we need to be selling our science more. And I'm wondering whether we need to start building into all of our ocean observing systems, monitoring capability of the wonder and curiosity and excitement of actually doing this, these observations. But there is going to be power costs and also people costs and expertise. And I'm just wondering, coming from Woods Hole and yours and coming into us, how do you see us doing that really? And what's the balance and how do we do that?
So you certainly won't hear any argument from me that it's always good to capture the fun of what we're doing, because there are multiple audiences that should hear that. The people who give us money, the people who authorize the people who give us money, the students who are going to be our next generation, even our colleagues whom we might want to attract here. Like, there's a lot of audiences who should hear this type of thing. In terms of working at Woods Hole, like, Woods Hole has a very sophisticated PR machine, and it might not be exactly the model we would like to replicate here. There's other ways to raise our visibility. I think one way to maybe go about it, and like, I don't think there's a solution that will work for everybody's research program, but getting other people, like finding one way to get another type of just being focused, like I want to communicate to this group, or I want to energize this constituency, like just pick one. And then you can build a plan, like an outreach plan or a communications plan. I know it sounds overly formalized, but if you have that in your mind, it might help you identify the easiest way for you to do this. Because my experience is that there's always more people you can talk to, and it's hard to see the return on that investment sometimes. But if you're jazzed with students, or if you're jazzed with communities, then you should focus on that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
my question though is, is more of how do we collect the data for doing that?
Yeah, sure.
So, are we supposed to be having a GoPro attached to our moorings or, our heads as we're
Yeah.
going out to sea? Or what is it that we need to, how do we collect that data and make that?
So GoPros on buoys, lots of people are doing things like that, and you're right, it's really compelling. There's ways, and if you're interested in telecommunicating that data in real time, we could talk about that too. There are ways to be intelligent about that without eating up all your radio time. I don't think, you and I can definitely talk about this, like for your particular applications, certain things might be smart, and certain things might be not so great. Like for Greg, I could put a GoPro on his deep cargo and, that's not going to be the solution for him. Or, I don't know, maybe your audience is not looking for excitement in there. Anyways, I think the temperature profiles are kind of exciting myself.
There was a big predecessor of that, Arctic webcam. There was a webcam in the North Pole webcam. It was North Pole Ranger.
Yeah.
Or was it just Arctic?
It's on the wall out front here. Yeah. I think that's great. I've seen a lot of that done recently too, where people actually have taken images now underneath the ice, or their image on top of the, let's say, ice buoy that sees the bear when it shows up. That's biofouling that you want to be aware of when it happens. There's a scientific reason to do that. But yeah, there's a lot. If you're interested in that, come and talk.
Yeah, I think that it is difficult for us scientists sometimes to think, well, the temperature is really the exciting part about this.
Right.
But in fact, getting some images or drama from, say, the bubbles that happen from breaking waves can actually make it more real for our stakeholders, but also provide quantitative information for the processes that are happening. Anyway, it's hard. And I actually think that this is something that we need exposure to, and kind of, have you thought about that,
Yeah, so there's in my mind, what you just described has three legs in that stool. There's the science, a technology that can enable capturing some sort of thing that can be presented to the community, and then a communication specialist who knows how to connect that information to the receiving audience. So yeah, another one of these interdisciplinary problems.
Yes.
Yep. Go ahead, Jamie.
So I'll go over that. Thank you, great talk, very interesting. In fact, I was taking notes and making connections in my head of different areas where your background would align nicely with things. So that was great. So my question, so you've been on the ground now, I think, for 3 months, give or take.
Yes.
So it's not very long. You're still kind of in, spin up mode and listen and learn mode. But I'm curious, but that's an interesting time actually to ask you this question, which is sort of, someone who's now kind of been around long enough to sort of get an impression of this place, of this lab, where we are, where we might be going, but still coming in with sort of outside eyes. I'm curious to hear, what are some of your initial impressions of PNEL, and where you kind of see opportunities, where you see, just.
Yeah, so I see so much potential here. I think there is a mindset at this institution of not shying away from, long-term tricky problems. And I like working in those types of environments. I've been privileged over my career to work in, I'd say, 4 such places, just being my 4th. And so, to me, that's something I have no control over. If I didn't feel that, then I would go, right? I can't, it's like when I was training students, like I can teach them how to do stuff. I can teach them how to understand material, but I can't teach anybody to be curious. And I can barely get people comfortable to work outside their comfort zone. Like those are, in my mind, basically immutable aspects of students and people. And so knowing and seeing that attitude here to me is number one. Like those are things I have no control over. They're organizational, cultural things, and if they don't exist, there's no hope. So I'm really excited about those types of things. Like I've had any number of conversations with people just doing what I do, like throwing stuff out, like spaghetti at the wall, like, what about this? What about this? And there's been more, a lot of receptiveness to that. So that's number one. But the second thing is kind of capacity building and resilience. So, somebody like Russ would really know this, or people who work in IT. There used to be a time in the world where you could keep ahead of things because all you had to deal with was like Microsoft and, maybe Adobe, right? Like the keeping up an IT platform was straightforward because those two companies had scheduled rollouts, like it was doable. And nowadays is the complete opposite. How many network devices are in this room? And then that's just messing around with the hardware infrastructure. What types of software need to be working together, and those are all updating asynchronously. We now live in an environment where IT people are going nuts. And it didn't used to be that way. I just gave you that story as an analog to what I see in technology too. Like technology has moved so much since when I got into the field, since when some of my students started a decade ago, back in a former job. And it's important to understand that landscape so that you will figure out how to fit best into it. I understand also, we're a government agency and we have many, many different types of stakeholders. I'm still learning which stakeholders seem to have the most synergy potential for us. And I think that's important. I don't think this is the type of thing we can do alone. Just technology is so complicated now, the way it's been distributed amongst geoscience. But I guess those are the top two things. A lot of potential and an attitude for trying out new things. I like that. And just be careful about how we gear up for the next decade. I'm sure there's more.
All right, I'll ask you a science question instead.
How about a science question?
So I thought your blips on your LSS sensor were pretty cool.
Yeah.
But how do you turn that into sort of a meaningful number oceanographically?
Right. So this is definitely a cultural thing. It's probably one of the hardest things to get used to if you're somebody with an engineering background trying to get a graduate degree in ocean ecology. Like the way you collect information and the types of information that can be valuable to you differs in disciplines. Like there's no way that we can do physical oceanography the way we do it now without specific quantitative numbers with error bars, right? It's just, there's descriptive physical oceanography, but by and large, those rely on accurate measurements to temperature. In ecology, it's not the same thing. Sometimes you have to find comfort in plus or minus an order of magnitude. So I think that's half of your question. Like it actually depends on the field. Like sometimes you don't need to turn those things into quantifiable, precise data in order to learn something about the system. Because, for example, maybe what you want to learn is just presence or absence, or did it start? Yeah, go ahead.
Let me get rid of the softball question. But when I saw your image up there, I think to myself, what's the biomass?
Sure,
Are you measuring export?
sure.
Those are two big questions, especially export, that we're going to need to answer if we're going to do anything in the way of marine carbon dioxide removal, understanding climate, et cetera, so forth and so on. The export is a big unknown.
Absolutely. And so just throwing a fluorometer into the ocean is not the way to do it. Throwing the fluorometer into the ocean shows that you can see systematic changes over the season. You can assign numbers to it that behave, that proxies that do sort of like what you're expecting. And then you take the next step, try to refine those proxies. So just to let you know, if I were still doing this stuff, where I would go next was not worry about a profile, but I would build a pumped optical sensor that sits at a depth horizon so that I know how much water volume goes in front of the sensor over a certain amount of time. And that's actually one unconstrained thing about the profiling measurements. I'm not profiling through a fixed volume, I'm profiling through an effective field. And I don't know how fast the field is vecting, so that's affecting my measurement too. So sort of moving it step by step, but knowing what you can do and then taking the next step of how can I make it better. I'm not saying this is, what I was showing you was not supposed to be a quantitative proxy at all.
No, it was just really cool that you used such a simple sensor
Yeah.
to get at what you did.
Yeah, and most people would call that noise. It's like back in the days when people found thin layers in the ocean, coastal Oregon. They saw these big blips and just assumed that they were noise, but they're actually phenomenal. There are huge abundances of algae in that much depth, orders of magnitude. Yeah, it's a good question, though.
I have a follow-up to Joe's question. So you showed chlorophyll A with ranges that are pretty low,
Yeah.
12.4.
Yeah.
Given your background in bio-OSH and engineering and light,
Yeah.
do you believe any of that? I mean, so taking into account how the thermometers are calibrated, looking at in vivo fluorescence or not, and
Yeah.
for people in this room, many of whom don't do chlorophyll work, but do rely on sensors that say micrograms per liter, or it's a drop-down menu. Do you believe any of that data, given the errors are 50, maybe 100% easily?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the 80 North under ice chlorophyll measurements, yeah, I believe there's chlorophyll there in the
Yes,
summer, right?
but
And-
0.4 micrograms.
Right, so that is down in the dirt,
You know,
close to the measurement range of those sensors, even in optimal conditions. So I could spend another talk commenting on the quality of chlorophyll thermometers now versus 30 years ago. Like, that is one area of ocean instrumentation that is no longer, and I'll just use the phrase used right here, appropriate for climate. It's like, we just don't, you can't buy one off the shelf as accurate as they were 30 years ago, because people have just turned to these things, right? They're just not good. And so, no, I think in order to do article research on those questions better, somebody needs to engineer a better barometer again. And this is just something that we have as a scientific community advocated to industry. Industry has not been our friend in maintaining quality enough instruments that accept. In a different type of career, I can imagine leading some sort of initiative to bring commercial technology back to the scales and the accuracies that we need, because a lot of the market doesn't build what many of us need. Yeah. So yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on the phone with other companies.
I don't want to keep going on it, but my pet peeve on cruises is seeing someone pull down menu, go from fluorescence to chlorophyll.
Yeah.
And use that data in a paper or a talk, and it doesn't really translate into that.
Not very accurate. You know.
Well, the good thing about this situation is you're here.
I'm here, so the people in the room can stay.
Yes, you can stay or go.
Yep.
That's like,
Yeah, exactly.